Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
It'll sure shake your windows and rattle your walls. But the times they are changing. Yes, they're changing.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of Mindshift Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, welcoming you to this great edition with former Scientologist Chris Shelton. I met Chris on the Cult Survivors Network Facebook page, which, by the way, if you're not a member of that and you are an ex-cult member or ex-fundamentalist, ex-evangelical, it's a good place to join, meet up with other cult members, or ex-cult members, I should say, who have come out of the world of cults and who are looking to network with each other. Anyway, I saw Chris, he had posted a video. He's got quite a large following on YouTube. And in fact, that reminds me, I'm going to be posting a link in the show notes to Chris's channel. Now, a lot of the videos that he does on his channel, if you just do a search on Chris Shelton Scientology on YouTube, you'll find him right away. A lot of the videos that he does are obviously about Scientology. And he posted some stuff about the Leah Remini Scientology, the Aftermath series. So I went and watched those and thought, okay, this is a guy I should really get on the podcast. And it's kind of funny, though, that even though Chris is an ex-Scientologist and does a lot of speaking out against the church in terms of its belief system, the damage that it does, particularly around this area of suppressive people, labeling someone a suppressive person, that is anyone who speaks out against Scientology and what it does to people and how its practices work, how the organization actually functions. But this is a very destructive policy. It's damaging because when you label someone, as Scientology does, a suppressive person after they've left the church or the cult, then what happens is the people that are still in the church are told that they have to disconnect from that person. And as Chris will describe in this episode what that actually looks like, it's a very damaging, very destructive policy. And this is something that is absolutely part of Scientology's playbook. This is not just a one or two people sort of thing that happens. This happens to virtually every former Scientologist. And so we're going to get into a little bit of that. But what I found interesting was that before we started recording, Chris and I were talking about what did we want to cover, what topics do we want to touch on. And I mentioned the idea that, well, I'm interested in helping people to recover, to reconstruct, that as I've been talking to former cult members like Stephen Unthank and Laura Kaput from Australia, and Dassie Ehrlich, who's going to be coming on this show when she gets back from her trip from Israel and New York. We're going to be talking about what their experiences were. We're finding out that what happens to people both in fundamentalist or evangelical Christianity as well as mainstream recognized cults like Scientology, like Jehovah's Witnesses, the Children of God, 12 Tribes of Israel, NXIVM, whatever name you want to put in there, you can just list cult after cult after cult. What you're finding out, what we're discovering, and this is what Chris and I are going to talk about, we're discovering that we all have basically the same plot line. In other words, if you remove the ideology from whatever that particular cult or church group was teaching, the psychological coercion, the manipulation, or as Chris calls it, the cult mechanisms, how the mechanisms actually work psychologically and so forth, they actually have the same or very similar effect on people's psyche, their psychological development. And we're going to get into what exactly that looks like and how people are reconstructing, recovering their identity after they leave the cult. Or in the case of some, like Rick Ross said a few weeks ago, if you left a cult, if you've left a destructive church, a controlling church, but you haven't gone through the process of educating yourself and recovering your lost identity, you're going to end up, chances are, going right back into yet another cult. And so Chris and I are going to touch on what that looks like as well. So we're not really going to be talking a lot about Scientology, although obviously we are going to touch on it in this episode. However, in talking to Chris, we've decided that we're going to come back maybe in a few months and actually just do a standalone episode on his experiences in Scientology, what the organization is all about, how it actually works, what do they believe, kind of give people a rundown of the basics of Scientology and how they can recover their identity if they've left the cult of Scientology. So there's a lot of good information in terms of that episode. I'm really looking forward to it. I learned a lot from Chris, and it was a good discussion as far as bouncing ideas off of each other and kind of realizing that our stories, as I said, if you remove the ideology, if you remove the theology or the belief system, I'm coming out of fundamentalist evangelical Christianity, he's coming out of Scientology, but we could be describing in so many ways the exact same thing, or virtually identical experiences. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. And as I've been saying, as I've gone through these episodes and talked to various people, I'm learning so much, and I'm going down this rabbit hole. The whole thing about the psychological coercion that groups use to influence and manipulate and control people, that does a tremendous amount of damage psychologically. And of course, when you get into cults as well as churches, we know that there's a lot of economic exploitation. There's sexual abuse that goes on. This is not limited to the world of the cults. We heard from Stephen and Laura a few weeks back. Yeah, it's a huge epidemic within the Jehovah's Witnesses, but it's just as bad in the Catholic Church, for example, the Southern Baptist Convention. You know, these things are going on all the time, and they're now coming to light as more and more people speak out about their experiences. So this is what I'm trying to do, is to help people process through, really unpick the conditioning. How were you controlled? How were you manipulated? And by shining a light on these practices and these tricks and tactics, it can help you to, as I say, unpick the conditioning, start to go back, rebuild, reconstruct your identity that was lost or suppressed, or maybe never even had one in the first place. And we're going to get into the differences between first and second generation ex-cult members, what the differences are, and you will, I think, be able to place yourself somewhere in that spectrum, on that scale, and say, that was me, this is where I was, and this is where I'm at currently. So I think this is going to be a very helpful discussion just coming up in a few minutes here with myself and Chris Shelton. I'm just going to say real quick that in 2 weeks, the next episode that's coming out features a return visit from our friend from Canada, the Naked Pastor David Hayward. We've already done this recording, and I'll tell you what, it's another phenomenal recording. I passed along to David all the thank yous from various listeners that were helped so much by those 2 parts that we did last year. So if you haven't heard those, in preparation for my upcoming discussion with David Hayward, I would encourage you to go back into the archives. You can find them all on my account on Podbean, which is a good app. You can download that on your mobile phone or your tablet, and you can get all the new episodes as they come out every other Friday. But if you cannot find it, just send me a message. You can send me a message on Twitter. You can find me at Mindshift 2018. You can follow me there or send me a direct message on Twitter. I will provide you the links for the 2 episodes with David Hayward, the Naked Pastor, and that'll kind of give you a sense of where both of us are coming from as ex-evangelical pastors of many, many years. In this episode coming up, in the next one coming up, we're going to be talking about the religious trauma that people both in churches and in cults experienced. And he has a huge following of people on his Lasting Supper website. And so he's been asking them about religious trauma. What did they experience when they were in evangelicalism? And that has fed into our talk about religious trauma, recovering from that. So I think, again, that is going to be a super helpful, very practical episode. So stay tuned for that coming up in a couple of weeks. All right, let's go on into my discussion with Chris Shelton. We're going to be talking about this idea of escaping the cult bubble, and how even though there might be different ideology between various cult groups and churches as well, there is very much a common ground, the same psychology, cult to cult and group to group. I'm happy to be joined by Chris Shelton. You are an ex-Scientologist, avid YouTuber. I guess you're an advocate speaking out against the Church of Scientology. Is that correct?
That is correct. I have been out of Scientology for about 6 years now, and 2013 was the year I really got out, and 2014 was the year I really started speaking out for real, and under my own name, and not anonymously, and not hiding, and that sort of thing. And I've been a proponent of critical thinking and an advocate against cult thinking ever since.
Yes, I saw that you have some other videos on your YouTube channel. Most of it is dedicated to Scientology from what I could see, but you do have some other ex-cult members, and you've got some other information on the cults. What's your connection between that and the world of Scientology? I mean, if you'd say, okay, Scientology is a cult, is that where you're going on and discovering more connections with other religions, other worldviews?
Absolutely. That's exactly how it happened, is I got out of Scientology, I had been in Scientology, by the way. We might want to establish for your listeners.
Yeah, I was going to say, we got to touch on that.
I was a Scientologist for 27 years professionally, or 25 years professionally. In other words, I worked for Scientology. I didn't just take part in a couple classes, you know. And I actually grew up with it. My parents were Scientologists for a really long time, too. We're all out now, but at the time, you know, that's how I grew up. So I was always a Scientologist my whole life. And getting out of it, I came to learn about cults and destructive cults. And that's a term we use specifically as destructive cults because it differentiates from just regular groups of people who get pretty into what they're doing. You know, a cult is just a group of folks who are, you know, united around a common principle or purpose or belief or idea, and they get pretty hardcore about it, you know, but that doesn't necessarily imply abuse or that there's something wrong. People can be enthusiastic about things, and there's nothing wrong with that. What I found in coming out of Scientology was that there's all kinds of groups out there where people get very fervent and their belief becomes so strong that it becomes a kind of extremism. And that's what first started opening my eyes to these other groups out there besides Scientology. And once I started connecting up with other former members of these other groups, we started finding all kinds of similarities between our systems, between our belief systems, between the control mechanisms that existed in our groups, how the leadership controlled the followers, how the followers acted. All of this stuff is very, very similar from one cult to another, even if the belief system is radically different.
That's absolutely what I'm discovering too, because your journey and mine, we're coming into the same space through different paths, but I'm coming out of fundamentalist evangelical Christianity. I would have never said that I was part of a cult when I was in it. I mean, I was a minister. I was like you. I was deeply embedded in it. I was a Bible college teacher. I was propping up the system. I was drinking the Kool-Aid. But now, as you say, looking back on it, I'm starting to make all these connections, not just with evangelicalism and fundamentalism, but as you say, other cults. In fact, it was watching a series on the Crime and Investigation channel over here in the UK called Twisted Faith Week, where they had ex-Scientologists, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, ex-Mormons, ex-Church of Islam, and their stories were all remarkably similar. And I said, I've got the same kind of story too. What does that mean?
Yep.
You know, so I started researching it, and here I am. I'm doing series on the cults, and so I've met you through the Cult Survivors Network on Facebook. So I saw your video about Leah Remini's Scientology, The Aftermath. So it's just amazing how we kind of work these rabbit trails and we end up meeting on one of them somewhere.
Well, exactly. And there's so many resources out there that I think that where we're headed is a general sort of merging of a lot of the former members of all of these different radical destructive groups. And we're starting to find all these similarities, and we're starting to see that there are models of behavior for this, and there are models of control that are the same because our psychology is the same. Whether our beliefs are different from one to the next or our ideas are different, how we think about those ideas, how we respond to certain words and phrases and ideas and actions, those are the same or very, very, very similar from one person to the next. So I have found in my journey that getting into psychology, sociology, and even biology and neurology has been very helpful for my education in learning what happened to me. And the more I related to other people and their experiences and their groups, they seem to find common ground with me on these things. And so this is why I'm kind of excited, really, because I think that us coming together as former members of these different disparate groups shows this commonality and it offers a way for all of us to maybe recover more easily by using some really basic scientific principles and not the woo-woo nonsense that we used to believe.
Yes, that's exactly similar. Exactly similar. Is that a word? It's similar to my journey because when I started reading a couple months ago, Robert Lifton's book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. I don't know if you've read that, but he's studying.
It was one of the first. It was
Yeah.
one of the first I got hooked up with.
Yeah, so it was one of the first books I read, and what struck me right away as I was reading it, okay, he's talking about prisoners of Chinese communist thought reform centers, but the psychology of it, as you say, is remarkably similar to what the cult groups are manifesting, isn't it? I read some of the chapters and I thought, my God, this is exactly what's happened to me in fundamentalism, and obviously he's related right into the world of the cults as well, with his paper on cult formation and infamous chapter 22 in the book and things like that. So it is seemingly it's like a ubiquitous thing, isn't it? Why is it so common universally, besides the psychology of it? Why do you think it's so universal that people get sucked in and recruited to these kind of groups?
Well, there's a few reasons. And it's interesting because this is one of the mistakes we make is, I'm not saying you're making this mistake, but I just wanted to comment on this because I find it's something I used to do all the time, and I'm finding that other people do it too, and that is looking for a single reason for something.
Yeah, there's multiple
when there are,
reasons.
in fact, multiple reasons for it. But it basically comes down to a longing, yearning, period of instability, period of concern or upset or worry or trauma that happens to a person in his life or her life for some reason, shakes things up, puts them in a situation where they're not quite as sure or certain or on solid ground as they used to be, for whatever reason. Could be anything from the death of a loved one, death of a child, to moving locations. You're, a 17-year-old graduates high school and goes off to the big city to go to college. His whole world is rocked. He's on very shaky ground. He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't have any friends. He doesn't have any contact. Somebody reaches out to him from a cult, says, "Hey man, I'll be your friend," right?
The love bombing and all that. Yeah.
And before he knows it, he's involved in the Hare Krishnas or Scientology or whatever, right? So many different avenues, but they all seem to have that mainly in common from one person to the next, is there's something about themselves that they want to change or improve. There's something about themselves that they don't like or they want to do something about. And who doesn't have that going on?
Exactly. We're all vulnerable on certain levels, aren't we? There's that era, maybe it's loneliness, as you say, a death of a loved one. Your life is a bit unstable, and here comes someone who seems to offer the solution to your problems. And it's not, they're not, if it's Scientology, for example, they're not going to tell you about Xenu the first day, are they? If at all.
Oh, no, not even on day 3 or 4 or 20 or 100 are you going to hear about Xenu. You're going to be hearing about you and all about you, and they're going to want you talking more than they're talking.
Yeah, and it is helpful. That's
all
the
about
thing.
you.
One of the things I've really caught from watching the Leah Remini series is that virtually every person that joined Scientology as an adult, they weren't born into it, but the ones who actually, like you described, a vulnerable person, they said it was helping me. It really was. I mean, if you're talking about yourself and you're unloading your problems to basically a therapist, it's going to be helpful. It's cathartic, isn't it? So at first you're thinking, I feel better. I am doing better, and they're helping me. And that's how you get gradually pulled into the group.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, it's not
That's
a nefarious thing.
And whether there's money involved or, in some cases, sex is involved or some other kind of, relationship investment of some kind, they get you slowly, gradually, but surely reeled in. It's very much like a fish on a reel, They give you the bait and you bite it and go for it, and then they're just reeling you in. Well, that's how it works.
You mentioned I was watching one of your YouTube videos, and you said people ask you all the time, how could you be so stupid? How could people be so stupid?
Yeah.
And you say, obviously, that's a misnomer, isn't it? In fact, a lot of times, more educated and very bright, intelligent people do get pulled into cults. It's not about intelligence, is it? It's about that vulnerability or whatever it is that the cult is offering that appeals to that person, and somehow it can bypass, in a way, their sort of rational, intelligent side. I mean, what's that about as far as just intelligence quotient?
Well, see, that's the thing. IQ itself is fairly controversial as a measurement of much of anything.
Right.
But if you use it from one person to the next, and we say, okay, fine, there's IQ. It measures how much you know or how smart you are or how you can figure things out. none of that has anything to do with why you join a cult, or any group for that matter. Not one person who ever joined a destructive cult would have told you, I'm joining a destructive cult,
Yeah.
right?
What are you
No
doing
one
today?
thinks that.
Yeah.
No one. They don't have that idea. What happens is they hear something that somehow makes some degree of sense to them. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter who's telling them. If it makes some degree of sense, and I'm talking mainly about emotional sense here, more so than intelligent, rational sense. If it somehow makes them feel like there's some degree of hope, or there's some degree of compassion being given to them, some empathy, some understanding for their plight or their situation, it doesn't really matter who the person is who's doing it. They're getting an emotional satisfaction from this conversation or from this technique or method or whatever, however it is they're being introduced to this thing. That emotional satisfaction is the thing that sells the cult. The explanations or the rationalization that the cult gives the person is a mere explanation. It may or may not be true. It doesn't matter. The person feels good. They feel right. They feel like they're belonging or accepted, or in some way, this encounter that they're having with the destructive cult is giving them some kind of positive emotional feedback. And based on that emotional feedback, they then invent their own reasons. And we all do this, by the way. But this isn't just specific with people who join cults, but the mechanism is that the person feels this emotional attachment and belonging, and they feel better for some reason, whatever the reason is. And because of that, they then join up and want to continue that good feeling. And as long as that feeling continues, or can be made to continue, even artificially, they'll stay. And that's how it works, basically.
That's how it works. Well, we got to put in there the piece of the sort of Messiah-like charismatic cult leader, because that's got to be another compelling factor in so many people's joining these cults, isn't it? You look at both political cults as well as religious cults, almost exclusively there is a founding person, usually a male, who is that sort of charismatic, narcissistic personality who's sort of a Messiah figure. I mean, you could look at Charles Manson, Jim Jones, David Koresh. You know, the list is virtually endless on the religious side, even L. Ron Hubbard. And then the political sphere, Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, the mass rallies. A lot of people, you know, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, a lot of people would point to Donald Trump and say he's kind of got a cult of personality going with his base. You know, so these characteristics are seemingly, again, universal. There's that charismatic leader. That's an important piece as well, isn't it?
It is most of the time.
Most of the time.
Most of the time. I'd say like probably 99% of the time. There are cultic groups that do not have a centralized leadership. Those are fewer. I'm referring, for example, to sovereign citizens here in the United States mostly. This is not a group that has a central leadership, but it does have a cult mentality and a cult sort of thinking that enters into the people, the sovereign citizen folks, right? But the model you're discussing or talking about is the much, much, much more common one, where you do have a leader or leaders. And yes, you're absolutely right. Mostly male. Not always, but mostly male.
Very rare to have
mostly
a female.
For some reason. Whether it's because they can exude positive fatherly emotions or because they talk a good talk, or, you know, somebody like L. Ron Hubbard, that guy wrote, I mean, he lectured, he gave like thousands of lectures. He wrote tens of books, thousands of issues that make up the body of Scientology knowledge. So, you know, you can find something to agree with in all of that.
You can find something.
Scientology is actually kind of unique that way because it's so big, it's so voluminous. There's so much to it. You know, with most brands of Christianity, you have a Bible and maybe some other sacred works, but mostly that. And in Scientology, you've got just reams and reams of stuff, you know.
He was a very prolific writer for sure, wasn't he? Not just as a science fiction writer, but then, as you say, there's volumes and volumes of Scientology books written and articles and things that they've used. It's something that they require their members to buy and everything else. I mean, I've seen this on the Leah Remini show. You're required to buy all these volumes and volumes of books and tapes and thousands of dollars. Would you say that Scientology is a more on the spectrum, is a more destructive cult in the sense that you were talking about this on your YouTube channel with the disconnecting policy, with the suppressive person policy, in a sense? I mean, every cult group, I guess, practices shunning of ex-members to some extent, don't they? But Scientologists, they seem to take it to a whole different level of really cruel policies, don't they? What is it that's so cruel about that? That, I mean, obviously you're splitting up families and friends, aren't you?
Oh, it's quite bad. It's quite bad. Because, you have the Amish, you have the Mennonites, who most people mistake for the Amish because they dress similarly and act similarly. But the Mennonites practice a form of shunning that is much, much, much harsher than the Amish do. Scientology's form of shunning is even worse than the Mennonites. And I've never run into anybody outside the Mennonites who was harsher than them. And unless you're talking about radical Islamic terrorists who believe that apostasy is a death warrant. They'll literally go kill you if you're an apostate in radical Islam. Scientology will not kill you. I mean, there's conjecture about a couple cases. People have died because of Scientology, but not because of the shunning that gets done. At least I can't point to any specific case and say that guy was killed because he was an ex-Scientologist. I can't say that for sure. But I can say that people's lives are ruined, families are broken up, businesses are broken up. I mean, we're talking about lifelong ruination here because people have been separated from mothers, fathers, kids, brothers, sisters. I mean, the whole anything you can kind of imagine on that line, it's happened in Scientology.
Would you say that in terms of the trauma, that is that one of the ways that the leaders of Scientology control their members? I mean, that's a source of psychological pressure and trauma. If you leave, this is what's going to happen to you. We're going to disconnect. You're going to lose your friends, family. You've got a mother, a father, children in the system still. So that's got to be one way they can exert some control over the followers.
Oh, huge. It's emotional blackmail. It's nothing short of that. And it's used ruthlessly in Scientology. It's not an accident. It's not just, happens to a couple people. Oh, there were a couple mistakes made. No. In Scientology, it is purposeful, it is direct, and it is very much a control mechanism because it's used as a threat to premeditatedly keep people from leaving. If you leave, you can go, but...
There's a but, yeah.
You're never going to talk to your family again. You're never going to see, you're going to get declared a suppressive person, and then, we're going to label you, and then nobody's ever going to talk to you again. It really needs to be understood that in Scientology, there is no exception to the disconnection. Once you're disconnected in Scientology, there is no connection allowed. No phone calls, no birthday cards, no New Year's texts, no, smiling as you pass them in the store. I mean, nothing. No contact allowed.
Completely cut off.
And it doesn't matter what your relationship is. It just doesn't matter.
Yeah, and then, of course, there's that fear of if you then speak out, because then they take it to a whole different level as well, don't they? A person like yourself, I'd be curious to find out if, I'm sure you've been labeled an SP from Scientology. Have they actually come after you? Because we've heard horror stories of hate websites, private investigators picketing out in front of their businesses, following them wherever they go. So there's this noisy investigation and trying to ruin people's lives who speak out against the church. Have you had that happen to you?
I have. Hubbard's words and directions on this are a matter of dogma for Scientology. It's not an option for them. You are to ruin them utterly. That is what Hubbard said to do for people who are critical of Scientology. Now, there are far too many people in the world for Scientology to go after everybody, so they tend to limit their actions toward former members. Leah has gotten a tremendous amount of attention from Scientology because of the show that she and Mike Rinder put together.
Yeah, I can imagine.
That's gone for 3 seasons and was even won an Emmy. So that was a pretty big blow against Scientology, and Scientology wasn't too happy about that. So they hired PIs, and they hired lawyers, and they followed Mike and Leah around, and I mean, to the point of ludicrousness. I mean, when you're following some guy's wife to the grocery store just to harass them and intimidate them, I mean, that's pretty sick.
Pretty low.
And that's Scientology's modus operandi. You know, that's what they do.
But you're wearing people
I've got
down.
a hate website against me, full of lies and nonsense. I mean, none of the stuff, hardly any of the stuff that they wrote on the website has even got any basis of truth to it. And they just make stuff up. They don't care, you know. They just want to trash you in a public venue or somehow make it seem to the world at large that you, as a critic, are not to be trusted. The problem is that the way they go about it is so incendiary and so obviously blatantly gross and disgusting and almost a violation of the law that everybody sees what they're doing and they just go, you guys are a bunch of nutcases.
Yeah, they can
But
see through it.
Scientology keeps doing it because they are a cult and they don't have any choice. They have to do what they do. And because of what they do, that's why they're a cult. So it's all kind of
the circular
silly,
thing,
you know?
isn't it? Well, can we talk about the psychology of it? Because I know we want to talk about some of the reconstruction after you've come out of the cult. Now that you're out of Scientology, looking back on it now, how would you say you were conditioned? How did the psychology of it work? Because you were a Sea Org member. Maybe for people who don't understand what that is, can you explain what does it mean to be a Sea Org member?
Absolutely. The Sea organization is, and that's SEA, by the way. That's sea is in the ocean.
It's like a nautical
is a
thing.
paramilitary group that exists within the core of Scientology. They explain it by saying that the Sea organization is basically the clergy of Scientology, but that's a very loose word, a very loose way of using that word clergy, because it's not like we were walking around in collars and black Cossacks, you know. We were in naval uniforms. We had ranks and ratings and yes sir, no sir, how high sir, and we were working 24/7 for Scientology.
Yeah, I've heard
I did that for 17
work.
years. So that's a living, you know, they pay for your room, they pay for your food, they uniform you. The food is not that great. The birthing sucks. I mean, really bad.
Not even that good.
It's funny, actually, if you've ever seen that blue building that says Scientology across the top of it.
Yeah, the one in Los Angeles?
Yeah, that building in Los Angeles, the blue one.
Right.
That's where I lived.
Oh, right.
That building is where the Sea Org members live. That's where they sleep.
You're like the hired troops, essentially.
I worked across the street. What's
right.
that?
You're the hired military. In effect, you're on staff 24/7. What kind of things did you do? Were you serving the executives, or what exactly were your duties during the day and the week?
Well, it's not just during the day and the week. Just so you know, it's 24/7. That means it's all day, every day, 7 days a week. I worked from about 8 in the morning until 1, 2 in the morning every day.
So what would your normal day look like?
I did executive work. I did supervisory work. I did public service work. I did recovery work where I was actually out knocking door to door on people's houses and trying to get them to come back into Scientology. Most of what I spent my time doing in the Sea Org was from an executive function. A lot of Sea Org members are administrative staff who are overseeing the management of Scientology internationally. So that's one of the functions I carried out for the Western United States. And I did a lot of, and I made books. I worked at the in-house publishing facility for about 9 months. I mean, I did a lot of different stuff. All of it, you know, ostensibly to forward the aims and goals of Scientology.
Yeah, we're going to clear the planet.
But most of it was just pretty stupid busy work, to be totally honest with you.
In terms of the psychology of it, I mean, you know, you're looking at it from the outside, you're describing economic exploitation, which is one of the hallmarks of cults, isn't it? Sexual and economic exploitation of the members is a hallmark of many cults. I'm sure people have asked you this. They say, well, how come you didn't just go, wait a minute, I'm just being worked too many hours. This is too much work. I can't sustain this sort of pace for year after year after year. I mean, I work an 9 hour day and I'm pretty tired. I get to go home and be with my family. You didn't get to do that. You're working crazy hours. How come you didn't say to yourself, wait, this is nuts. I've got to get out. Or did you? I don't know. How did you end up getting out?
Well, eventually I did, but it took me way too long to figure all that out. I've always said I'm a bit of a slow learner. I mean, it was a lot of things that finally got me to wake up. It was a period of about, 10 years before I finally did. But the reason why really has to do with the word fervor. I was fervent. I was a cult member.
You were a dedicated
that
follower.
implies, by definition, a much, much stronger form of commitment and a sense of personal obligation to the group and to the group's goals and what it's all about. The entire activity of a cult is to convince you that your importance is second all the time to that of the group that you're a part of. This is one of the reasons why they're so unhealthy. There's nothing wrong with being dedicated to a group that you believe in. But when your needs, not your wants, but when your needs are being subsumed by the cult, right? So you don't get to go to the doctor today because you're too busy working for the cult, right? Or you don't get to go see your mom this weekend because you're not going to get that vacation time approved because we have this emergency and it has to be dealt with, and it's your job to deal with it, so you're the one doing it. And you have this feeling, you've been convinced, at least I was, both growing up in the group and then starting to work for it, with all the indoctrination, daily doses of indoctrination. I was convinced that the group that I was part of was saving the world. And I was so sure of it that I was willing to basically be a martyr for the cause. And I willingly gave up vacations and time off and all that kind of stuff because I thought that what I was sacrificing for was for the greater good. And that I was literally, not figuratively, not kind of symbolically, I literally thought I'm saving the world by what I'm doing today.
That's so
when you
interesting.
have that kind of mindset,
Yeah.
you're willing to do all kinds of things that normal, regular people would never do.
For
the
the greater
problem
good.
with all of this is that I wasn't saving the world. I was being lied to every single day, being told not just, some hyperbole or some exaggeration, but I mean outright lies about what Scientology was all about, what activities it was actually engaged in, where the money was going, what we were doing. All of these things were smoke and mirrors. I was under a complete delusion about what we were up to. And I was under that delusion not because I'm delusional, but because I was told a number of lies over and over and over again, as were my parents, by the way, when I was growing up, which is why they passed it on to me. And I believed them. And I was kind of silly for believing them, but they sounded really plausible.
And it's all you knew. Well, if you grew up in
I
it.
thought, we're doing the thing. We're doing the good job. We're saving the world. We're gonna, I'm kind of being a hero with my life. That's what I'm doing with my life.
Yeah, you're kind of a martyr complex going on. I was going to say, I could replace the ideology and what you just described in your fervor and why you worked so many crazy hours and for so many years. I mean, I did basically the same thing when I was a pastor. I was working between probably 60 and 80 hours a week for years and years and years. Now, nobody was asking me to do that, but I thought I was doing the same for the exact same reasons you just described. As an evangelical, I was going to save the world. We were on a mission for God. Like the Blues Brothers, man, we're on a mission from God. We're going to save the world. And so your own personal things.
Anything's possible.
Exactly.
And you're actually up for just about anything.
Yep. So,
and I want to stress something here because this is really important. There's a personal responsibility to this, which is undeniable. I can't say I didn't have some stake in that game, but I really need to stress the degree of deception involved because this is pretty universal from one cult to another. Like I said, the fault here is not being dedicated or not believing in something. There's nothing wrong with that. But when it's all based on deception and lies and smoke and mirrors,
now we
you're
got a
being taken advantage of.
Yeah,
there's no
exploited.
other word for it, right? You're being conned. And that's what Scientology was for me. And I'm pretty sure that's what, your evangelical experience was for you as well.
Yeah, I would say the difference between evangelicalism maybe and a mainstream sort of cult like Scientology, it's so diverse. It's not a one monolithic sort of organization with a person or a group at the top. So it's a little bit different, although there are some fundamentalist groups that are absolutely about economic exploitation so they can, get involved in the political sphere to push their political agenda, and people like, Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority back in the 80s and so forth. So people like him were doing stuff like that. They would lie to people. They didn't care if it was about fundraising to get their agenda across, then they would do and say anything, fear mongering and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, there are overlaps for sure. Well, now you mentioned.
And
go ahead.
That's one of the things. Let me just comment on this real fast. That's one of the other important things to look at with this stuff is people often ask, well, was L. Ron Hubbard did he believe in what he was saying?
Right.
Does David Miscavige believe in what he's saying? And it's an interesting question, but ultimately a moot one. In that, you can make a value judgment on whether a person's a con artist or not by whether they really believe in what they're preaching or not. But if they're lying to you, and they know they're lying to you, in any shape, in any form, in any way,
whatever it is,
then who cares if they believe some of it or not? The end result's the same. Whether they believe it or not, you're still as abused and subjugated and persecuted as you were before.
Taken advantage of. Well, and that's the thing is what you mentioned before. You grew up in Scientology. Is there a difference in terms of the reconstruction piece? People who get out, who were born into the system, versus people who entered it as adults? Because that's like first or second generation cult members. I've read some stuff about the reconstruction process looks a lot different for people who were born into it versus people who actually joined it and then left. Do you find that that's true?
Yes, very, very true. And that's a really good question, in fact, because there are huge differences.
Right.
A second-generation member of a cult is somebody who was raised in it or basically born into it, right? I mean, my parents got involved when I was about 4. So for all intents and purposes, most of my living memories in my life are in Scientology. So there's a little bit of theory I have to explain here in order to make this make sense. But here's what happens. Psychologically, when you get involved in a destructive cult, especially one of personality, where you have a leader, a central leader who's like one guy or one woman, what tends to happen is the cult leader's personality tends to be copied or duplicated down the line by all the cult members. They tend to want to act like and be like and say and talk and think like the cult leader. He is the role model. He's the thing to emulate.
Yeah, it's a cult of personality, essentially, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
This is literally a cult of personality.
Yeah, literally.
But it tends to be like this from one destructive cult to another to another to another. This phenomena tends to happen of the membership emulating and wanting to literally recreate themselves in the cult leader's image. So you spend your life emulating, copying, thinking, trying to actually change your own personality to reflect your understanding or view of the cult leader's personality. And this is an actual psychological thing. I mean, it happens.
Yeah, that's a thing.
And what happens in recovery is when you have somebody come out of cults, they're very confused. They don't know up from down. They don't know black from white. There's a lot of indoctrination in cults. And a lot of the indoctrination that gets done is pretty goofy stuff. It's pretty not very sensible, rational information. But people can make anything make sense if they want it to. So that's kind of how it tends to go. But their personality is not their own anymore. Their personality is that of the cult leader. So they approach life thinking they've sort of created, if you could imagine this, it's more complicated than this, but it's kind of like if you could imagine a great big filter that gets put over your brain so that every thought you have or every idea you have or every goal or purpose that you have for your life gets filtered through this idea of what would the cult leader think of this? Or what would the cult leader do or say or think if he were in my position? We used to reinforce this in Scientology by asking ourselves, if we were faced with some sort of a problem or dilemma, we would ask ourselves, what would Ron do in this situation? This was a mantra. This was a practiced thing in Scientology. This wasn't just something I came up with. This was something that was actually a thing. And so you try to constantly reinvent yourself in the cult leader's image. So when you come out of a group like that, in recovery, you have to go back in time to your pre-cult personality, the person who's really you, And you have to kind of rehabilitate that and work out what the differences are between who you really are and your pre-cult personality versus the cult personality. And this is one of the ways that people address a cult experience when they're in therapy, is they sort of work this out. And it takes quite a while, depending on how long you were involved, of course. Now, here's the problem, getting to your question now, here's the problem with second-generation cult members. There is no pre-cult personality to fall back on.
Exactly.
Their entire
That's
life
all they've ever
has been
known.
a cult. So the way you deal with somebody who's a second generation member is very, very different, because you can't just go back in time to who they really are, because who they really are is pretty much the cult personality, and you got to kind of strip out from that the cult elements, and it takes a lot of education. It's not just therapy or talking; it's education. It's separating out the cult beliefs from fact. Sort of separating out the fact from the fiction, so to speak. And that can take an awful lot of work for somebody who was raised with these principles. And that, unfortunately, is the situation I'm in. So I've been working on it for the last 5-6 years. And it's been a real process for me, to figure stuff out. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about so you can so anybody who's listening to this can get it really clear how this works. One of the things I addressed when and I did this myself, I didn't have to have a psychologist around to do this, but one of the things I addressed when I first got out of Scientology was my homophobia. I had been raised and believed that homosexuality or anything connected with that, anything having to do with the LGBTQ community, was perverted and actually a sign of mental illness. And the only solution to it was Scientology processing or counseling.
Right, that'll
Nothing
clear up
else
the problem.
would do it.
Right.
Right? And I was under the impression, not only was it a mental illness, but according to what L. Ron Hubbard wrote back in the 1950s, no one who was in the LGBTQ community can ever be trusted for anything. Hubbard calls them covertly hostile.
Right, they're
They're
suspect.
the kind of people who will smile in your face, but they have a knife hidden behind their back, and they just can't wait to plunge it into your back. Right?
That's a lot
That's
of
the
homophobia to
idea.
work through.
And Hubbard was very clear about this. So I believed it. So when I got out of Scientology, this was in 2012, and the rise and growing popularity of equal rights for the LGBTQ community was a very hot topic at that time. Still is in many ways. And I was confronting this, this issue, this social issue, and I was thinking, I might not be thinking clearly about this because of my Scientology education.
Might need some work here.
So I actually went and read and studied and found out about the LGBTQ community and who these people are and what do they want and what are their goals and what are they trying to, what's all this equal rights about. And it took me a couple weeks, but after actually meeting some people in the community and interacting with them and making friends with them and finding out about what they want, I found out there's nothing covertly hostile about these people. And there's nothing mentally ill about them either. They were perfectly normal people. They just happened to think differently about gender issues. And I was like, well, okay. Yeah. There's no reason for me to be hating on these people. There's no reason for me to think that they're mentally ill just because L. Ron Hubbard said so 70 years ago. So once I put two and two together, I was able to sort of, process out the homophobia. And now it's not there anymore. But it took some real work on my part to make that happen. And that's just one example of the kind of thing I'm talking about that I've been working on over the last many years to strip out of my head Hubbard's teachings and replace them with science and reason and, things that people know about in the real world, right?
That's the thing. You've been in the bubble, though, haven't you? That's the problem.
Oh, my God.
This is
I was in a total bubble.
Yeah. And again, you could put any religious cult or any group in sort of that bubble, couldn't you? I mean, I was in the evangelical fundamentalist bubble. Others are in the Jehovah's Witness bubble, the Scientology bubble. So as long as you're plugged in, this is what Rick Ross said in our podcast a couple weeks ago. He said that as long as you're plugged into the group and you're receiving their downloads only, then you're going to find it's going to be hard to think. It's going to be hard to think critically and rationally. Once you unplug, as it were, from the group and physically leave it and psychologically leave it too, then you can begin to start, like you say, working through those issues, and you can actually start thinking a bit more clearly, which it sounds like your experience with homophobia was a good example of that.
Yep. That's exactly. You nailed it.
You got to unplug.
That's exactly right.
Now,
we all live in our bubbles.
Yeah,
I mean,
we do.
Let's be honest, right? Everybody's got their areas of interest. Nobody can live in the entire world. There's just way too much going on. So we all have bubbles of one kind or another. But here's the thing, and this is again a key difference for folks if they're listening to this, is when you choose what bubble you choose to be in.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Full power of choice over whether you leave or stay in that bubble, then you're okay. But when you don't have any choice, you have to stay in the bubble, or you're being threatened to stay in the bubble, or there's going to be bad things that are going to happen to you because you choose to think independently, that's when you have to start wondering whether there's something cultish going on.
Yeah, you might have a problem. I'm curious, too, on this issue of reconstruction. What would you say has been the biggest single helpful thing that you've done or been a part of since you left Scientology that's helped you sort of recover that identity that was, well, you didn't have one in the case of what you're saying.
Exactly. I have to figure it out, right? It's always me.
You're
I would
constructing
say, God, that's a hard question to answer as far as a single thing, because there have been so many
Maybe
things.
there isn't
I've gotten
one.
counseling. I have done a tremendous amount of education. If I was going to say one thing, I would say education, but that's very broad. I've read extensively former members' stories coming out of Scientology. I've interviewed tons of former members of my group and other groups. I think probably learning about cults in general, not Scientology, but cults and the psychology of cults, I think that was the first big step that I took that really made big, big differences in the way that I thought and the way that I looked at the world and the way I was able to analyze my experience with Scientology. I'd say after that was learning about psychology itself and also sociology too, because they're both very, very important. There's a lot of relevant information in both of those fields about cults and how and why cults work. So I think education on those lines was the thing that really helped me the most in being able to step out and away from the cult thinking.
I think you're right. That's something that Rick Ross said as well. Education is the number one thing that you can do once you've unplugged from the cult and you've physically and psychologically walked away. And like I said, but that's a huge area. You're exactly right. The same thing is happening to me right now as I read Lifton and Lawless and some of these other cult experts and sociologists. As you say, the lights are coming on. And I'm saying, my God, this is how I was conditioned. This is how I was manipulated. This is how I was controlled. And I'm unpicking the conditioning, as it were. And I think that's very liberating, isn't it? Because you go, okay, I'm not the only one that this happened to. This seems to be a pretty universal thing. As you say, I can put myself right in this circumstance and I can see how I came out of it on the other end with various traumas and triggers and issues that I've now got to go back and work through. But I'm identifying what those are thanks to the reading and talking to people like you and other ex-evangelicals, ex-cultists. So it is hugely important for sure.
Oh, but
you can't overstate it.
I think it is not just invaluable. I think it is absolutely necessary. I can't see any way that you could possibly say that you've recovered from a cult if you don't really understand what happened to you in the first place. And that's what that education gives you. It's not about learning about good groups and bad groups and, making decisions based on values or beliefs. It's about understanding structure and methods and the methods of abuse that exist in these groups, and how through our own weaknesses in our psychology, because we have plenty of them. For example, we're hardwired to want to be part of groups.
Yeah, we want
it's
community.
necessary for our well-being and our good health.
Yeah,
that we be involved socially with other people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
but
we
that
need
need that we have can be taken advantage of. So you have a basically good idea. You have this instinctive sort of push or thrust to be part of groups and activities, but we also have a follow the leader mentality, because we come from packs, right, or herds. That's where we evolved from. So this idea of having an alpha male, so to speak, I mean, I think the whole alpha male thing has been a little bit debunked, but the idea of a leader certainly is not. Every group has a leader or leadership of some kind, and most of us aren't going to be the leaders. We're going to be the followers. And it's built into us how to be followers. And one of the ways that we're actually indoctrinated into it as children, because you have to, and if you're ever going to survive school, right?
Same
experience. You can't get through school if you don't learn how to follow some orders and direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's kind of built into us to be that way. And we have to be wary of the kind of leadership that we receive. That's our responsibility. That's on us. That's one of the things you have to learn about coming out of a cult, is you got to learn about how to be a good follower versus, follow anybody who tells you what to do. Because there's a lot of people out there who are going to tell you to do things that are not in your best interest. So as a follower, you have a responsibility to make sure that your leadership is a good leadership. It sounds kind of, I don't know, some people might think that sounds goofy. Other people might think it sounds like common sense or whatever, but you can see all around you in all kinds of groups, politics, sports, religion, bad followers. You see bad leadership, and we're always talking about the leaders, but how about the followers?
Yeah, what about the followers?
So it goes both ways is really the only point I'm trying to make. And when you learn about this stuff, you can be a better follower, because you can be more responsible for the decisions and choices that you make, and you can kind of learn how to find, or what are the red flags? What are the things I should be watching for? There's plenty of them, but you have to learn them.
Exactly.
Otherwise, you'll just go from one cult to another.
And that's something else too. Rick Ross mentioned that if people come out of a cult and they don't go through those processes of education, unpicking the conditioning, therapy, they oftentimes will just jump right into a different cult. So they'll just out of the frying pan into the fire.
All the time.
And so that's another real danger for someone. You can say, well, I've left the cult. Well, what have you done since then? Nothing. I've done nothing to reconstruct.
Exactly.
That's a really good point. Things to be careful
It's kind of a shame. You learn about people, you learn about human beings and how we're put together and our psychological makeup and our brains and stuff, and there's so much to learn. So much amazing information out there. But you learn about all this stuff, and it's not going to necessarily proof you up against joining another cult if you're not paying attention to what you're doing.
Exactly.
I've made plenty of mistakes since I came out of Scientology. It's not like I'm talking from a position of infallibility now. I have made every mistake 10 times over since I left Scientology, So there's a lot of trial and error in all of this too. The answers to be found are not as specific and certain as we would like them to be. There's still so much to learn and so much for us to discover about ourselves that it makes it very, very frustrating and sometimes even difficult to figure yourself out or figure out other people or figure out why things have happened to you the way that they have. It's a lot of work, and sometimes it's very frustrating work.
It's a lot of
work. But
ultimately,
it's the most rewarding work because you're helping yourself rather than relying on somebody else to tell you what to think or what to say or what to do.
Well, even
and
on
that really is the important thing about getting out of cult.
Yeah. I was going to say, even on your point about how you've made mistakes post the cult. I mean, I've read an article the other day that talked about first-generation cult members. A lot of times they'll regress. They'll try to recover that lost adolescence. And so that can become a pattern. They can go off and, smoke dope and grow their hair out and get a tattoo and, rant at other people on Facebook and in groups and lash out and all that. And then they kind of work through that phase and then they kind of rebalance again. Whereas second generation, they're not trying to recover that lost adolescence because, as you say, they never had one. So they go down a different route. So even those reconstruction can become patterns, can't they, in people who leave cults?
Oh, yeah.
There tends to be things that we all sort of do. And then we realize, everyone else kind of did that cycle too. So, even in that, there's a pattern.
No, right. Everything you just said, I've done. I did.
Did you get a tattoo?
I grew my hair out. I grew my beard out. I got a tattoo. I smoked dope. Of course, I live in Colorado, so it's okay
legal
to smoke dope. It's perfectly legal here. But you know what I'm saying. I've gone down all those rabbit holes, and course, I've gotten into every fight you can get into on social media and, tried to preach tolerance and understanding, but made all the same mistakes everybody else does because I'm human too, and you kind of have to learn what that means. And it means that we're very, very fallible and we're going to make tons of mistakes. And there isn't anyone on this planet who's got it all figured out. So trying to rely on somebody else to tell you what's what and what to do and what to think, that's the most basic mistake we all make. And if we stopped making that mistake, there would be a lot less nonsense and cult activity going on in the world.
It's so funny you mentioned tattoos because I always had tattoos when I was a Christian, but they were always covered up. They were like underneath my shirt sleeves. And I never,
I see.
Yeah, I was into tattoos, but if I wanted to hide them, it was very easy for me to do. I just had to put a t-shirt on and nobody could see them. But a few years back, I thought, you know what? I've always wanted to have full sleeves. And I went out and I got both of them finished off. And I thought, this feels like the person I actually am. I didn't I didn't want to let that stop me from sort of being authentic. And so that I feel comfortable now in my skin, even though it's all covered up with ink. But every tattoo that I have selected, it means something. It's very critically important to me. I put a lot of thought into it. I didn't just go get the flash art off the wall in the tattoo shop. So even in that, I guess now I'm seeing that's part of my reconstruction, as you say, doing all those things. Maybe it's a bit of regression, but it's been helpful for me anyway. I don't know if that works for you.
Yeah, I wouldn't even call it regression,
Yeah.
What I've learned, and I'm no expert in this, so I'm only throwing out a little tiny bit of what I've learned here. But, we have stages of development, right? And there have been various models put together as to what those stages are. One of them is that in their teenage years, later teenage years and early 20s, we have this messianic phase, the save the world phase, right? We want to save the world. We think we're up to the challenge.
We're going to get it done.
We haven't quite realized yet that the world doesn't need saving.
And we're not the ones to do it.
Because we're still young and innocent and kind of stupid, right? And that's what happens. And then you get out of that phase and you move on to more mature phases where you're raising kids and all the rest. One of the theories out there is that when you join a cult, your phases of development sort of stop. They were going along a regular course as you're going along through a regular life, but then when something really that crazy and insane happens to you that you join a cult, especially a full-time deal like I did, you stop or you halt or you slow in your development. And I believe that could be true because when I came out of Scientology, I was, 40? This was 6 years. I was like 42 or 43. And I immediately I nerded out, I geeked out, I went back into movies and Star Wars and Legos and all kinds of kind of goofy stuff, which I still very, very, very much appreciate, but it was kind of picking up where I left off a little bit.
Exactly. That's the adolescence, isn't it?
And over the years, I've kind of gone through that phase and moved on. And I would say at this point in a self-assessment, I would say I'm more mature now and have a more mature outlook now than I did 6 years ago when I first got out of Scientology, because many of those aspects of my mental development just stopped when I was in.
Right. You got to pick up the threads now.
Yeah. And now I'm moving forward again. So I'd say that is a phenomena you could see or you could track with as far as cults go.
Yeah, and that's, again, something that happens over and over and over to so many people. Well, I'm curious, too. I know one of the things we didn't get into, we talked about before we hit record, was we didn't want to get into your story as a Scientologist, even though that's a fascinating episode. I'm sure that would make a great one. But if someone wanted to hear your story and your time in Sea Org and all these other things, where could they go to hear about your backstory in Scientology and kind of how you got out and all that? Where would they find that?
They would find that in a couple places. First place they could find that is in my book. I wrote a book about Scientology, and it is not a memoir. It is a critical analysis of the whole subject. And it actually breaks down Scientology and explains the belief system, explains who L. Ron Hubbard is, explains how they got tax exemption. I mean, all of it's in there. It's a pretty good book.
Yeah, very thorough.
But the first chapter is about me, and it is my story. So that's all in my book. You could also go to my YouTube channel, which is just my name, Chris Shelton. I put myself out there as the critical thinker at large because I don't want to be thought of as the ex-Scientologist at large.
That's not the only thing you talk about.
Critical thinking is very important there is that. You can look me up on YouTube. If you Google my name and Scientology, you'll find me straight away. And there are interviews and talks I've done on my channel where I explain my entire Scientology story.
If people wanted to get a hold of you on social media, where would they find you? On Twitter, Instagram? What's the best place to find you on social media?
You can tweet out to me at Shelton Designer. That's my Twitter handle. And I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook page that is public-facing, that is the Chris Shelton Critical Thinker at Large page.
Well, I very much appreciate your time, Chris. I mean, I don't want to keep you too long, but this conversation, this was exactly what I wasn't sure what was going to happen. I thought we were going to be spending more time on Scientology, but I'm actually much, much more appreciative of the fact that we've gone into the reconstruction and the psychological aspects of cults in general, because I think that's a more, again, it's a more universal thing. It's hopefully going to be more helpful to people who have come out of virtually any controlling group or groups of undue influence, whatever you want to call them. So I'm really glad that you've offered that perspective. I think it's going to be very helpful for a lot of people.
Awesome, man. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to do so, and thank you for giving me the freedom to talk about that stuff.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it.
I'm more than happy to discuss Scientology or any aspect of it anytime if you want to do this again. I just wanted to get some stuff out there that I thought might be more broadly applicable. So this was a good time.
No, I think it really was, and like you said, it has a broad appeal to it. Well, let's maybe say, okay, let's do another podcast. I don't know what your schedule is. Maybe come back around in a few months if you're available and actually take a deep dive into the world of Scientology, because I've got a lot of questions that I want to throw at you. So I would love to come back around. If you're up for it, I would absolutely love to have you back on.
No problem. You just reach out to me and let me know. I'm more than happy to talk about it.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
I think it's pretty clear I like to talk.
Yeah, I think I've enjoyed it. I really have. I'm glad to make a new friend you're living in Colorado, is that right? So I'm in the UK, you're in Colorado, but enjoy the Rocky Mountain High, and I will enjoy North Wales, and we'll talk about Scientology another time.
Awesome, man. Talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Take care.
Yeah.
It suddenly occurred to me that as I was listening to this episode when I was editing it, that Chris never actually mentioned the title of his book. If you are more interested in learning a little bit more about Chris's story, as he mentioned within Scientology itself as a former long-term Sea Org member and all the rest of it, you can buy his book, which is called Scientology, A to Xenu, an insider's guide to what Scientology is really all about. Now, you can go to Amazon and buy the book, obviously, there, or look on his website. Another thing you can do is, if you are interested in helping to support the ongoing work of Mindshift Podcast, if you're not already a Patreon supporter, there's another simple thing you can do, and that is you can go to my homepage, which is the Preacher's Forum. You can look there, and I'll put this link in the show notes as well. I have an Amazon affiliates link page, and I will put Chris's book on there. You can buy the book through my website, and that will help support the work of what I'm doing, help cover my expenses. So you can buy the book a couple different ways, help support Chris, as well as support the work of Mindshift Podcast. Once again, I just want to say a big thanks to Chris Shelton for being on this show. You can find him on Twitter at Shelton Designer, and you can also look up his website, which I will also put in the show notes if you want to go read some more articles. And also there you'll find the link to his YouTube channel, which has a lot of videos, as I mentioned before, mostly about Scientology. So those are all very valuable resources. You'll also be able to get a little bit more information about Chris's own backstory. But as I mentioned, that will be coming up as well. I'm going to be getting a hold of Chris again, and we're going to do an episode largely on his time in Scientology and how he got out. Just want to remind you that coming up in 2 weeks is my discussion with the Naked Pastor David Hayward, talking about religious trauma suffered by people coming out of cults as well as evangelical or fundamentalist churches. As I said in the introduction, that's going to be a very helpful discussion. So stay tuned for that coming up in a couple of weeks. So thanks again to Chris Shelton for being my guest this week on Mindshift Podcast, as we've helped hopefully some people escape the cult bubble and understand the psychology of it. Even though the ideology might be different cult to cult, group to group, as we discovered, the results really are very often the same. So I hope it has proved to be a helpful conversation Anyway, I've been your host, Dr. Clint Haycock. Thanks for joining me along this journey.